Okay, so I'm going to talk for 20 minutes apparently.
Go.
Let's see how we go. Okay, so I mean, I think that was a good introduction to what happened. I mean, in particular, it's crucially important to understand the role that the modern currency played in forcing people out and to demonstrate from the bazaar in Tehran, which you saw in the footage earlier on there. This is the deliberate strategy conducted by the Americans with the Zionists and indeed with financial institutions in the United Arab Emirates. It was successful in the sense that they got a protest, a genuine protest, out on the streets. And that, of course, was the mark for the Zionists and the CIA operatives to head into all the relevant places where they wanted to have demonstrations and to cause mayhem, burn out mosques and schools and libraries, and indeed to attack people in general, including some of the people on their own side, there's accounts of them actually executing people by shots to the head who were actually there to support them. So that of course all happened, and that was the plan. Now it's also said that many of the places in which the demonstrations occurred were places where they believed that there is reconstituted Iranian air defense systems. So, of course, their purpose, like it was before the 12-Day War, was to access and destroy Iranian air defenses. Now, it's not clear whether that happened. I think it didn't happen, but that was a part of the objective, is to have demonstrations in places where they could potentially access Iranian air defenses, which, of course, some of which were destroyed on the ground before the 12-Day War really got going. And that's something which people, I think, don't understand. They think that it was the Americans or Zionists who destroyed them from afar, but actually a lot of them were destroyed on the ground because they have agents inside Iran. Now there's a long history of that. I've been to the bazaar that you saw there, and to Tehran and other parts of Iran as well. But the first time I went to Iran, I went to an institution called the Museum of Holy Defense, and Holy Defense is the name that they give to what we call the Iran-Iraq War. And in that museum, it's mainly about the Iran-Iraq War. There's a specific other building in the grounds, which also is to do with the Axis of Resistance, which is a pretty extraordinary exhibition. But when I was there first, which was 3 years ago now, this display is no longer there. But there was outside in the big parade, apart from the British Challenger tanks, which were supplied to the Shah, which were as part of the museum. There were also 6 cars, and these were the cars in which Iranian nuclear scientists had been assassinated by the Mossad. The actual cars, and of course that happened as with the incidents I've been talking about. That happened by internal actors recruited by or sent by the Mossad, including all sorts of advanced equipment, let us put it that way, which had resulted in 6 or 7 of these nuclear scientists being killed. I went to the grave of one of them, a guy who was Fakhrizadeh, I think he's called, who was killed by the Mossad with, it now transpires, help from MI6. And you see that when you're in Iran. You can see the sort of visible signs and remnants of British power and of British interference in Iran. And maybe I talk about that a little bit. When I was there in 2023, I went back again in 2025. We did a documentary film, which you can see online if you want to look it up, called The Decolonization of the Mind. But one of the things I wanted to do, as soon as I found out we were doing this, I said, right, we've got to go to the British Embassy. And they said, oh yes, of course, we'll go there. I said, yeah, but do you understand why? And they said, well, of course, you don't understand why. Because it's the British Embassy. And I said, yeah, but the street that the British Embassy is on is called Bobby Sands Street, named after Bobby Sands, the Irish Republican hunger striker, the IRA officer commanding on the wings of the H blocks of the Maze prison, who of course died in hunger strike on the 5th of May 1981, after having been elected as an MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone. So that was my ambition to go there. So we went there to see that, and we looked around at the graffiti on the walls done by ordinary Iranians, including stuff in English about Ireland, fittingly. And of course, what the British did when the Iranians renamed the street that the embassy was on Bobby Sands Street was they walled up the entrance and opened the entrance on the other side of the block so they could have their headed paper without the name Bobby Sands Street written on it, which I thought was fantastic. So yeah, it's clear that not just the Zionists and not just the Americans, but all the British have played a negative role in Iran, continue to play a negative role in Iran. There is in this country over the last 5 or 6 years, well, since 2017 or 18, there's been a unit inside the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, is now called the HMG Russia Unit. Now that's been a venue for liaison between all the different branches of the British intelligence apparatus, meaning the Cabinet Office, Joint Intelligence Organization, Defence Intelligence, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. And that unit has led on disinformation and misinformation about Russia, starting in particular after the alleged Salisbury poisonings, which you might remember when Yulia and Sergei Skripal were allegedly poisoned by the most poisonous substance known to man and then died. And I mention this because what the British state has done since then is it has focused on fostering manifestly false propaganda operations, but also fostering covert operations in pursuit of British interests. And I'm thinking, of course, in particular here of what they've been doing in Ukraine since the special military operation was launched in 2022. And the reason I'm telling you all about this in a discussion of Iran is because this has been the mechanism which has been used by the British state to foster disinformation and misinformation in relation both to Gaza and in relation to Iran. They've spread their tentacles or their wings from misinformation in relation to Russia to misinformation in relation to Ukraine, and they've now added in the last 2 or 3 years special units within this the HMG Russia unit, which deal with Iran, with China, and indeed with Gaza and Israel and Gaza, as they call it in their internal documents. So we should be clear that this is not just a question of, however one might see it, US imperialism or Zionist push towards imperialism. It's also a question of British involvement. And when we think about British involvement, we are, of course, also thinking about British involvement, which is in cahoots with and in collaboration with the Zionists. So the MI6 role in the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist was done in collaboration with the Zionists. And that, of course, is what has happened to, I feel like I might be looking back to a golden past when the British intelligence services served British democratic interests. Obviously, that didn't ever happen. But what we've gone from is a period where in the 1940s, the British intelligence services assessment that the major national security threat to Britain was the Zionists, was what they called Jewish terrorism. And there are files in the declassified MI5 files, some of them are available online, hundreds and hundreds of pages of them on Jewish terrorism in the UK, never mind in Egypt and in Palestine. And so the British intelligence services have gone from that having that perspective to largely having a very, very slavish attitude towards the Zionists. Now, there have been some examples where that's not been the case, and in particular, you can note that, and this is the only time where I ever praised Margaret Thatcher. You can note that, for example, when the Zionists used Palestinian collaborators to assassinate the famous Palestinian cartoonist Najir Ali, who did the famous Handala cartoon. He'd been assassinated in Knightsbridge in 1986, and MI5 understood that this was the Mossad. And Margaret Thatcher didn't just expel a Mossad operative, she shut down the whole Mossad station in the UK. Now, if we had a British government which was capable of that kind of action, then we might see a very different way in which our politics would play out. But we don't have a government or a state which is willing to do that. To go on back to the question of Iran explicitly, look, in my view, as the film there said, and as I think the publicity in this meeting has said, the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is the tip of the spear of resistance to imperialism in the world today. He single-handedly fostered and spread and made into a functioning transnational set of military institutions, the axis of resistance with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Palestinian resistance factions. Let's remember that the Iranians didn't just fund the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They didn't just fund Hamas. They didn't just fund the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They funded all of the Palestinian factions without fear or favour, whether they were Marxist or whether they were Islamic or whatever was their politics. And they also, of course, helped and collaborated with Yemen, with Ansarullah, which, of course, has been a heroic force combating the Zionist entity. Without the Islamic Republic of Iran, there wouldn't be any kind of form of Palestinian resistance that we now know today. And all of the Palestinian resistance leaders, from Sinwar to Hania, have said, and many others have said that very, very explicitly. It's just that many people don't want to listen to those voices. And when we see what happened in Iran on the 8th and 9th of January, and I heard Professor Morandi there giving a very good account of that, it's perfectly plain that that was finished by the 8th and 9th of January. And since then, of course, we've had various attempts to resuscitate internal protests. The Balochi terrorist organizations have launched what they call a United Front. The Kurds have said that they are now working together as the PKK and Kamala and the SDF, for example. And of course, we had the Mujahideen Khalq, this kind of cultish terror network, which is the reason, of course, that Ayatollah Khamenei has a withered hand, because he was injured in a terrorist attack by the MEK back in the day. They have said yesterday that 100 of their terror personnel were either arrested or killed in the center of Tehran, making an attempt on Khamenei's life. Now, I haven't seen any confirmation of that from Iranian government sources, but it's clear that they are trying to create the idea that they can start something else internally. And I think that's probably mistaken on their part. But nevertheless, we have a very, very dangerous situation. It's looked variously over the last 3 to 4 weeks that there was an imminent war about to happen, and then it was put off and put on the back burner, and then they sent a second aircraft carrier, which is now, have you seen the stories about this now? Rather challenged in its hygiene as it heads toward down from Crete towards Iran. And so I think that what we see here, and we don't know, of course, exactly what we're seeing here, because we hear propaganda accounts from all sorts of sides, and it's not very clear. But and of course, some of what we hear is intended to stage manage our impressions and our emotions about what's happening. So it's intended to say, oh, well, they've done this. We know that they've done this on several occasions. But Donald Trump is pushing back against Netanyahu, and it's not going to happen. He's told Netanyahu. Some of that, most of that, is propaganda, and we knew that was the case. We know that was the case last time when the 12-day war happened. They pretended that they weren't going to do anything and tried to gull the Iranian government into a false sense of security so they could have the element of surprise. Now, of course, all of that will be happening. But it is looking like it might be possible that there will be some kind of movement in the next day or so, which could result in some kind of settlement or negotiation between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Americans. There was supposed to be something announced today, but it hasn't been so far. Now, if that happens, You might think I would think that's a good idea, but if that happens, that will be a surrender by Iran, and that will be a disaster, and it will end the Islamic Republic of Iran. Maybe not immediately, but it will sow the seeds for the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that is the worst thing that could happen, not just for the Palestinians, not just for the Iranian people, not just for the Axis of Resistance, but for the whole of world civilization. Because if that happens, what we will face is the dominance, enhanced dominance of the Zionists throughout West Asia and indeed beyond West Asia. I feel that that is the prospect that we face if they win this, and they only win this if there isn't a war and they are not defeated. And I'm afraid that's the stark truth of the matter as I see it, that either the Zionist colony is wiped off the map of the world. There is no longer a state called Israel. There is a Palestinian state. Or the Zionists and the Americans who are supporting them will win, and that will mean an entrenched a hegemony for the Zionists over the whole of West Asia, and indeed, I believe, beyond. Now, we might disagree with each other on that a little bit, but we are facing very, very serious times ahead, and we need to watch this very closely and make sure that we can do whatever we can to support the Islamic Republic of Iran, because I believe it's the last chance for human civilization on this planet. Thank you.
If I just talk, can you hear me? I'm not loving that microphone, and it sort of puts me off if my voice sounds funny in my head. It's like if you're doing a YouTube interview on someone and you can't see the person at the other end, you can only see yourself. I don't know how people do that. Anyway, so thank you so much to David. It was really good to hear his contribution. I agreed with 99% of it. The little bit at the end, I wouldn't take such a bleak view that whatever happens in the next 6 months or next 6 weeks, next 6 days, it's not the end of the world. The reality is the imperialist system as a whole is in a very, very, very deep crisis, and it's thrashing around trying to find a way to save itself. And Iran is not its only problem. And even if, heaven forfend, and I say that as an atheist, even if the worst happened and Iran fell, that's also not the end for humanity. It's not the end for the axis of resistance, either in the Middle East or globally. It's a horrific setback, but I absolutely believe that fundamentally the people will overcome all the setbacks that are in their way, because there's no other way for us. So, and you know, the axis of resistance, if we just talk about the Middle East, the axis of resistance has endured incredible setbacks for 100 years, and it keeps coming back. And actually, if we look at what we learned from the 7th of October is that it's now the resistance which is on the front foot. If you look past the statistics of civilian deaths, which of course are horrific, what we're seeing actually is not a picture of helpless victims at the mercy of the imperialists and their Zionist stooges in the region, and their various other stooges and proxies, including ISIS, including the UAE, and including all of the Gulf autocracies. What we're actually seeing is that the resistance can't be beaten, because it represents the will of the masses to be free and liberated, and they're not going to stop fighting until they are free and liberated. So the big picture for me is that. But because we've had the video and we've had fantastic detailed information about what's going on in Iran right now from Professor Miller, and I can't add to that. So what I want to do is talk more about the broad picture and the overall context for what's happening and why. And the first question we really have to ask ourselves is, why is Iran really a target? Because clearly it's got nothing to do with religion. Clearly it's got nothing to do with women's rights. Right? The propaganda narratives we're given, we know they're hypocritical and false. I mean, for a start, it's obviously ridiculous, isn't it, to say that your main concern is about democracy and then put up as your front person for the democratic movement the King of Kings, who apparently was born to rule everybody, right? I won't go into that. So it's obviously a lie that the propaganda narratives we're given don't make any sense. So why is Iran really a target? And fundamentally, the answer is it's anti-imperialism, it's sovereignty, its insistence on allowing the Iranian people to be a free and sovereign people. Now, if you want to understand, and particularly the British role is very important here, because the British were before the Americans when it came to colonizing and dominating the Middle East. They've become the junior partners now, but they're still exceptionally active. And we must never imagine that they are not. But the British ruling class has never forgiven the Iranian people for kicking out BP, British Petroleum. Before the first time the CIA and MI6 got together to overthrow a Iranian democratic regime, it wasn't religious. They couldn't use that excuse. It was very democratic. It was the government of Mossadegh, which lasted only 2 years from 1951 to 53, was overthrown by the combined efforts of the Anglo-American imperialist agencies because they had nationalized Iran's oil. And previously to that, now, correct me if I got this wrong, but I have a feeling that in the early days of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is what BP previously was called, the license on which the British took oil wealth from Iran didn't pay the Iranian people a penny in royalties. They simply took the oil. That is what imperialists consider to be their right. That's what they consider to be the proper way of doing business. And anybody who wants to get in the way of that is undemocratic and dictatorial and terrible and must be stopped. So Mossadegh was overthrown for that reason. When the Shah was brought back, the Western oil companies came back to Iran. And when the Iranian people made a second revolution in 1979, led, as we know, by Ayatollah Khomeini, the oil companies were kicked out again. And the Iranians gained sovereignty over their own wealth and resources and development. And since that day, for 47 years, Iran has been firmly sovereign, independent, anti-imperialist, because that's the only way to be sovereign and independent, and anti-Zionist. And of course, that's another reason that Iran can't be forgiven, because they have never, like Syria, with whom they allied from quite early on, like the Syrian Arab Republic, always refused ever to come to terms with Israel, so did revolutionary Iran, refused to come to terms with the Zionist colony, whose sole function is to act as a dagger to the heart of the Middle Eastern peoples, to stop their national liberation, to stop their decolonization process, to stop them gaining control over their own territory and their own resources. That's the function of Israel. That's what it's there for. That's why it's armed to the teeth. And that's why sovereign territories in the Middle East have always refused to come to terms with it. So, of course, Iran, in order to survive, and because that is the nature of an anti-imperialist sovereign state, has also made anti-imperialist alliances, which has also enraged the imperialists. So they have made cooperation with and alliances with North Korea, Syria, all of the factions as forces, I should say, as David said, as of the axis of resistance, whether they're states or armed resistance movements, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Russia, and with China. So you see again the essence of all of that. It's not ideology in terms of religion or socialism or anything else. The essence of that is anti-imperialism and the need for those countries that are trying to protect their independence and sovereignty to stand together. None of this is new. Okay, this has been going on for 47 years. So what is it right now that's propelling the war drive to such a kind of desperate and bellicose level at this moment? And I think we have to understand that in relation to the global crisis of the capitalist system. It's in a very, very, very deep crisis. I mean, we laugh about it, but I don't know how many of you have seen the Bank of England's warnings recently. Hands up if you saw the warning about the aliens. Okay, so this is not me saying silly stories. The bank, this was in the Independent. The Bank of England issued a warning which said, prepare for a meltdown in the markets if Donald Trump admits that there are aliens. Okay, so you see, this headline has to be put into two parts. The first part is the Bank of England is preparing for a meltdown in the markets. That is really significant. That tells you the state of the economy. They've been trying to keep it pumped with, all kinds of asset bubbles, with the AI bubble, with this, with that. But what they've really been desperately trying to do for the last few years is get themselves a big, fat looting bonanza of some big sovereign country's resources. They thought they were going to get Russia's in 2022. And 4 years later, they have completely failed. That war has backfired on them spectacularly. It cost them instead of gaining them. And it's costing them not only the resources they expected to get, not only blood and treasure, not only all of their weapons, but it's costing them face in the world. It's creating space for resistance movements to become more confident, to rise up, for the people in the Sahel to start getting independence and sovereignty, for people around the world to say, oh, maybe the imperialists aren't as strong as they've been telling us they are. Maybe all that money they spend on weapons is not the decisive factor. Their economy is in big, big trouble. So this headline that said, prepare for a meltdown, that tells you one thing. They know that they can't postpone the crash forever. On the other hand, they're trying to work out how to manipulate public opinion into not understanding what's the root cause of this crash. Meltdown. They're going to say it's a market meltdown. They're not going to say it's a financial crash. They're going to say it's a market meltdown, and they'll say it was triggered by a loss of confidence because of something that crazy President Trump said. Okay. But the truth is that's narrative management. That's not why the markets are melting down. The markets are melting down because there's a global economic crisis of the capitalist system. And it's actually been limping along since 2008, and in many ways getting deeper since that financial crisis. But it's not clear to everybody that that's what's happening, because the stock market seems to go so high. Surely that means that the economy is successful. Actually, huge bubbles in the stock market are a sign of great troubles in the real productive economy where wealth is actually produced. It's a sign of speculation and gambling and of the productive economy grinding to a halt. And the imperialist financiers not having anywhere productive and profit-making to put their capital. So they speculate in land, in asset prices, in stocks. And all those things see bubbles for a while, but not forever. So they are absolutely desperate to bring down all the countries that stand against them so they can indulge in an orgy of looting. And in that way, they hope, reset their crisis-ridden system. That's essentially what happened in 1991. You guys, some of you won't remember. Some of you will remember the 80s. There was a big depression going on in the 1980s, wasn't there? There was a financial crisis getting deeper and deeper. And in fact, the fall of the socialist bloc, the fall of the Soviet Union, saved the bacon for the Western imperialist financial system. They got to loot the resources of the Soviet Union, loot the resources of Eastern Europe, and that gave them a shot in the arm for 20 or so years. That's come to an end completely. And the crisis is deeper than ever. So they are desperate to restore profitability, desperate to remove all obstacles to their profit taking. And of course, sovereign and independent nations are the biggest obstacle to their profit taking. So the ultimate targets of the war drive are Russia and China. And Iran is seen as an obstacle to two things. In the Middle East, of course, specifically, it's seen as an obstacle to their regional domination. And the Middle East is crucially important. It's why so much emphasis is put on defending Israel, because Israel is an outpost of imperialism to control the resources of the Middle East, as I talked about earlier. And keeping control of the oil for the imperialists is a huge, huge priority. It's a priority because it is the most important geostrategic commodity. Still is the major fuel for industry and for the war machines. So it's a source of great wealth, and they want to loot that wealth. They don't want to buy it at market prices of the people that you just trade with. They want to get it for maximum profit, which means looting and controlling. They want to control it, control the supplies of it, in order to be able to deny supplies to their rivals. It's always one of the aims of imperialists when they want to dominate sources of raw materials. It's not just to have access to cheap materials themselves, it's to deny access to others. And the imperialists have made it very clear that one of their big strategic goals is to deny fuel to China. All around the world, they're looking, what was everything in Venezuela about? Fundamentally, they're trying to find different ways to cut off supplies of fuel to China in the hope that somehow that will weaken China and make it possible for them to overthrow the government of the People's Republic. Because that's their ultimate target in all of this war drive. So I think, yeah, I'm going to come to the question of British workers and why it matters to the British, but just as a little side note on this issue about the drive to war, it's very noticeable right now that the way the imperialists are waging their wars is in the main, not always, but mostly by proxy, using proxy armies. Proxy armies are being prepared, have been used against Russia in Ukraine. Proxy armies are being prepared against China. Israel is a proxy army. The Zionists are a proxy army. ISIS is another proxy army unleashed against the people of the Middle East and Africa. What the imperialists have got very good at is finding ideologies to give to their proxy forces, because everybody knows that a motivated army fights best. And this is a lesson the imperialists learned the hard way, because all of their weapons couldn't stop all kinds of national liberation movements with very low technologies from beating them. Look at Vietnam. What was the decisive factor? It was the people, the popular feeling of the people. And they were mobilized by their desire for socialism, which is a very strong ideology. When socialist ideology gets hold of a mass movement, it's very, very strong and overcomes humongous obstacles. You look at the history of the Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, you see the same thing, the Cuban. So the imperialists learned, we need to have ideologies. We need our soldiers to feel ideologically motivated. And what they've come up with is essentially weaponizing religions, turning them into supremacist ideologies. And Zionism is not the only one. It's not only Judaism they've done this with. Judaism was their kind of first go. The British began weaponizing Judaism and turning it into Zionism all the way back in the 19th century. But Judaism is not the only religion they've done that to. What is ISIS motivated by, if not by a weaponized version of Sunni Islam that has turned it into a supremacist ideology? And what is supremacism? Supremacism is any ideology that tells you you're the chosen people and everybody else is not really a person at all. And as we see from, all the kind of Epstein revelations, that is in fact a reflection of all ruling class ideologies. Fundamentally, if you're a minority exploiting class, you believe that you're better. You have the right to exploit, to loot, to rule, to have power over the masses, and the masses, in your view, aren't really people at all. So these supremacist ideologies, the imperialists have got very good at creating and imposing, and they combine them, of course, with money and weapons. That also helps people feel powerful and like they're on the good side if they're getting paid. I mean, we heard, didn't we, in particular, in Syria, that the Takfiris were getting, $1,000 a month plus weapons, plus this ideology that says, that God chose you and anybody you kill, God blesses you for it. That's a horrific combination, actually, isn't it? So Zionism is just one of these. I mean, they've even weaponized Buddhism. Don't imagine there's any religion that the imperialists can't study for long enough and find a few verses out of the books that they can, turn into a weapon if they want to, and they use their money. But it's also a sign of weakness that they do this. They've got a lot of money. They can throw money and they can throw weapons at things. But needing to use proxy armies is a sign that you're on the back foot, because one of the things they're actually really scared of is putting weapons in the hands of their own people. Sending their own people off to fight their wars is something that really terrifies them. They know that it's likely to end badly. So this is just to give a kind of broader picture of what we're looking at here. But I just want to bring it back to the question of Britain and British workers. Now, I hope you've understood from what David and I have both been talking about that this is not just some faraway foreign affair. It's not just the private concern of Iranians or people of the Middle East. It's not just a question for Americans, because it's the American government that's doing all the most loud saber rattling. Anglo-American imperialism is essentially one unit. The British and American financier classes are joined at the hip. They work together in lockstep. And the British ruling class is up to its neck in everything that goes on in the Middle East and in all of the operations against Iran, whether it's economic warfare, military warfare, sabotage, the British are involved. So that's one reason why we should care. They're supposed to be our government. We shouldn't be allowing our own government free rein to terrorize people around the world simply for the crime of wanting to be free. But there's more than that. There's more than just that. The reality is the British imperialist ruling class is the class that oppresses and exploits British people too. And part of the strength they get to be able to keep the British people down comes from the fact that they're rampaging all over the world and looting so much of the world. That's what makes them so rich, and that rich is what makes them so powerful. If the ruling class gets beaten abroad, if its sources of profit start to dry up, its ability to hold down the working class at home also gets weakened. And that fundamentally is the reason why the British working class always should make common cause with everyone who's fighting British imperialism anywhere in the world. That we have the same struggle against the same enemy, and we actually have a side in this war. We're not bystanders. We're not spectators. We have a side. We want Iran to win. We want Russia to win. We want China to win, because they are fighting our enemies. And we need to be helping to fight them. We need to be doing what we can at home on this front of the war to weaken the imperialists. We need to be making life difficult for them so they can't just freely rampage around the world. And that brings me to the question of what is it we should be doing? Because fundamentally, yes, we want them to win, but just saying, oh, I hope they win, that's not good enough, is it? We actually have power. We actually have power as the working class in this country if we learn to organize and use it. And what is needed is a mass campaign of non-cooperation with every aspect of the war machine, which of course includes with every aspect of Zionism, which is part of the Anglo-American imperialist war machine. No cooperation with making the weapons for the wars, with moving the weapons for the wars, with putting out the war propaganda that justifies the wars. You know, if print workers or media workers of any kind, or even supermarket workers said, we will not allow these lies to be put in front of the British people, that's a huge blow to the war machine. British working class has more power than it realizes it has. You know, ultimately, it's not the imperialists who fight these wars. It's not. It's ordinary people. Every aspect of the war machine, every single aspect is manned by working people. We need to wake up and start understanding that that is our power, and we need to start demanding that that power is harnessed. And fundamentally, that power is going to be harnessed when there's enough pressure from the bottom up to transform our mass movements. Because right now, our trade unions, our anti-war movements, our Palestine solidarity movements, every one of them is controlled by a bureaucracy which is loyal to the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is loyal to imperialism. And so fundamentally, our own organizations are being led by and controlled by our class enemies. And so a part of the organizing to create a genuine anti-war movement has to be transforming our mass movement, mass organizations, so that they actually can reflect the will of the people of Britain. And the will of the people of Britain actually is not in favor of war. I remember the demonstrations against the Iraq war, how huge they were. And at that time, the people who took to the streets really believed in British democracy. They don't anymore. And that was part of them learning not to believe in it anymore. But when they turned out, 2 million were on the streets on the 15th of February 2003. But the misleadership of that anti-war movement just said, well done for coming out, go home. The government knew it was safe to ignore that huge protest and was flying the bombers over their heads the other way. They were going to war anyway. They didn't feel they had to listen to the people. There was nobody harnessing that power to actually stop and disrupt the war machine and show those people how their will could be put into action. These are the demands we need to make. So I'll just very quickly signpost people on our party's website, which is thecommunists.org. There's a page on non-cooperation full of resources on what can people do to further this aim within the trade union movement, the anti-war movement, the mass movement, and another one on transforming our trade unions. What are the things we need to do? What are the steps we need to take? What are the demands we need to be taking in our workplaces, in our trade union branches? What are the things we need to be doing? So we have more power than we think we have. We are not just bystanders. We're not helpless victims. We're not reliant on Russia or China to pull our irons out of the fire for us. Fundamentally, the defeat for British imperialism happens here at home. Thank you, comrades.
Look, I come from a, what would I say? I come from a sort of traditionalist, leftist, historical materialist background. So I always had that idea that, you know, that it was impossible for the tail to wag the dog. That clearly, when the British Empire was in charge, and when the US took over after 1945, and you can make various arguments about when it was, or the extent to which it was, or the extent to which the British and American financial elite still just run the show. You know, I didn't have any sense that there could be any other way of understanding things. And I didn't come to studying Zionism by choice. I came to it by accident. I came to it through seeing the attacks on Muslims after 9/11, wanting to understand what that was about, looking at neoconservative think tanks, not even thinking anything about Zionism at the time, seeing who funded those think tanks, Henry Jackson Society, Policy Exchange in this country, and many others in the US. And then looking at these obscure organizations that we found, charities which were funding these Islamophobic think tanks, and say, well, what are these charities? All charities usually with the name of an individual, the Wolfsons, and realized, first of all, by looking at what else they funded, they were funding the IDF, they were funding the settlements, that these were Zionist family foundations. And it was through that empirical discovery that I started to study Zionism. And this is about what, 2010, 11, 12, when I was first accused of being an anti-Semite, I think the last time. And then I started to do that work. We did work on Zionist organizations. We did stuff on BICOM, on various other organizations, I forget now. And even then, this was in the context of a theoretical way of looking, which was not very different to the one that the CPGB-ML has today. I think what tipped it over the period of a large number of years, and actually only really in the last couple of years, 2 to 3, I mean, well, even maybe shorter period than that, is starting to understand the sheer magnitude of Zionist influence in many different ways. Now, I could spend a long time talking to you about this, but I'll not. So let me put this in a kind of quite summary fashion. So first of all, there's the question of, the most important question is the question of US power. When you look at the way in which there's been an infiltration of Zionists into the security apparatus of US power, meaning the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, Treasury Department, etc., etc. And culminating, I mean, starting off with something like, the Deputy Chief of Counterintelligence in the CIA, James Jesus Angleton, the only American intelligence officer to whom there are 2 public memorials in the Zionist colony to this day, through to the role of the neocons, read Zionists, in pushing the war in Iraq, the attack on Iraq, for Israel. And when you start to see that, you start to ask other questions. Well, what other kinds of powers are there? And you look at the role in West Asia of the Abraham Accords, and then you look at the way in which Unit 8200, the surveillance intelligence organization of the Israeli military, has set up thousands of companies which then supply spyware to the security and intelligence agencies in Cote d'Ivoire or South Africa or Nigeria or even Venezuela, actually. All of which, of course, have got back doors, which allows, when the FBI conducts surveillance and has covert human informants, that information goes straight back to Israeli intelligence. When Glasgow City Council watches the citizens of Glasgow going about their daily business with their CCTV, that information, potentially goes straight back to the Zionists. When Oracle, run by Larry Ellison, diehard Zionist, not an Israeli Zionist, runs the cloud computing for the Home Office, the Ministry of Defence, and the Foreign Office, which is what they do, that information, do we imagine it doesn't, go straight back to Israeli intelligence? Now, all of these are mechanisms by which the new form of global hegemony, I believe, is emerging. So you ask me, am I certain? Do I think there's a dialectical relationship? Is it a historical relationship? Yeah, of course, all of those things are true. But I think we are entering a period where it would be wrong to say that the tail wags the dog. The tail is only plucky little Israel, to coin that phrase. Because what's happened is that there's been an infiltration into the vital organs of the dog, such that the Zionists have a grip on them. Someone tweeted the other day about the 6 most important people in the US administration, all of whom are Jews or all of whom are Zionists. And these people run the American administration. Now, you can hazard a guess. People will say, oh, it's because of the Epstein documents they've got on Trump. No doubt that that's important somewhere along the line, but it's much more significant, much more fundamental than that, I believe. It's not just a question of compromise. It's not just a question of the lobby. It's not just a question of the Zionist movement. It's the infiltration of Zionists throughout the national security apparatus, which is the crucial element which goes along with all the other elements. And I think that's what's most important here. Now, I could be wrong. It might be the case that the US empire is going to resurge and they're going to abandon the Zionists, and they would make the deals with the Saudis and all those kinds of counter-intuitive narratives. But I don't believe I am wrong.
I see a more symbiotic relationship in that fundamentally, I think the funding for all the Zionist activity comes from Wall Street, comes from US finance capital. That's why the Zionist pockets are so bloody deep. How does plucky little Israel, that depends on disbursements every year to keep itself going, have such bottomless pockets it can buy literally every single USA politician and every British one and every Western European one? Well, that doesn't really make any sense. You know, AIPAC, you know, I think the concept of the Zionist lobby, the Israel lobby, is a little bit of a narrative construct. I mean, it's a mechanism, but the funding, you know, AIPAC is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and America is the fundamental part of that title. It has become so pivotal to US imperialist global interests to keep Israel going, because it's a really fantastic way of externalizing your army. To have it on a permanent bit of land, have the entire population essentially in the armed forces as a arm's length, deniable military that's always there, always threatening in the region where you are absolutely determined to keep control. I think that because oil, the control of oil, the control of the Middle Eastern oil, and let's not forget that if you add up all of the oil producers in the Middle East, you know, whenever you see a chart of, you know, where the most oil is, the Middle Eastern countries are all put in separately. But that is confusing. And it makes you not understand actually how significant the Middle Eastern oil is, because they've divided it into all these kingdoms and different places. Put it all together, right? It's one zone of activity that Israel is there to ensure imperialist domination over. And the oil, the significance of Middle Eastern oil is absolutely pivotal to modern economics, and it has been ever since the British Navy switched its ships to oil power in, I think, 1912. Right? That's when domination of the Middle East became like number one question and started to take over from control of sea routes to India in the minds of the imperialists of like, what's the most important thing you've got to care about. So I see the growth and the proliferation of Zionist supporting organizations. I mean, I'm sure you've read Finkelstein's book on the Holocaust industry, which is a brilliant expose of, and what was interesting about that was how he kind of documents, it's a long time ago since I read it, but as I recall, he documents how no one in the USA, no one was interested in the Holocaust in 1945. Nobody talked about it. His parents were victims of the Holocaust who went to the States, and they kept quiet and nobody wanted to know, nobody wanted to talk about it. The USA, the US imperialists discovered the Holocaust when they took over as the dominant power, patronizing Israel. From that point on, it became important to talk about the suffering of the Jews and put it on a particular pedestal in order to justify all the crimes of Israel, the existence of Israel, its crimes, you know, and to frame them all as protection against another Holocaust, and you know, to create that whole narrative construct, which a lot of us here grew up with, right? That Israel was necessary for the Jews because they needed protecting because of this terrible thing that happened to them, but they didn't care about the terrible thing that had happened to them 20 years earlier, when it was happening, or just after it happened. Nobody was talking about it. That wasn't when they started setting up all their museums. And the whole Zionist lobby and pressure, you know, machinery in the USA gradually flowered and was encouraged because it was useful to US finance capital. That's the way that I see it, and I still see it that way, I have to say. I think when it comes to this intelligence apparatus, Mossad is a branch of, as far as I see it, Mossad is a branch of the CIA. They're intimately connected. I think they're very interconnected with MI6 as well. I don't believe that there's a whole load of information going to Tel Aviv that doesn't also go to Washington. I don't see that. I don't think, Epstein was working for Israel. I think he was working for the USA. I think this is how the ruling classes of Western imperialism operate. The primary function actually is backdoor dealings. The ruling class, the real ruling class, is a very tiny number of people. They need all these kind of organizations to kind of keep. They need a huge machinery of control because there are a tiny number of people actually in charge, really looting the wealth of the world and keeping themselves in this position of uber power over the vast masses of the population of the planet. And the way they really get things done is behind closed doors. And the little bits we've seen from the files that have been released, what they really show you is how the deals are done behind closed doors and through personal connections. And this actually was something that was pointed out. Well, it was pointed out by Engels, and it was pointed out by Lenin, a long time ago, and it's got more so. Since Lenin's day when he wrote his classic text on imperialism, the wealth of the planet has become even more concentrated. So in the hands of even fewer people. You can already see the ground being prepared to throw the Jews, who for a while have, because of Zionism, have been enjoying favored status. There's all these claims about how anti-Semitism is on the rise, and of course it's nonsense. And the biggest creator of anti-Semitism, of course, is Israel and its horrific crimes, which it carries out in the name of Jews and Judaism. But you can see the ground being prepared for the Jews in general to be thrown under the bus at the point at which, the imperialists feel they're getting burned too much. And there's plenty of noise along those lines along the internet going now. And interestingly, as part of that, I am noticing, and this is something that I think is quite significant, because of course, from my perspective, the fundamental target of all imperialist ire is the working class. They're really scared of the working class. And so they're particularly scared of socialism and communism, which is the ultimate destination, as far as I'm concerned, of humanity. And obviously it's the death of imperialism, it's the death of capitalism, it's the death of the ruling class and their exploitative system. So it's not particularly surprising to me that the old Hitlerite tropes that communism and Bolshevism are a Judeo-Bolshevik, a Jewish conspiracy, communism is a Jewish conspiracy, is starting to surface again on the internet. So you see all of these lines being pushed as people start to become anti-Zionist, as people are horrified by the crimes they see being committed by the Zionists. The imperialists are already trying to make sure that anti-Zionism doesn't turn into scientific anti-imperialism and a real struggle for liberation and sovereignty, and instead can be diverted into just scapegoating Jews while simultaneously taking in the idea that socialism is somehow your enemy rather than, this evil exploitative imperialist system. How's your crystal ball, David?
Let me read something to you.
Oh, go on.
This is a report from Axios, which of course we know is a vile Zionist outlet. Trump's envoy, this was sent at 7 o'clock this evening. Trump's envoy, Vitkov, was apparently stunned by what he heard from the Iranians in Geneva. This is what I've been talking about. That I believe that what is happening is that the Iranians are offering what I would call far too much. And I think that is likely to result in there not being an American attack on Iran. Doesn't mean that there won't be a Zionist attack on Iran. It's pretty likely, I would say, that they would do it themselves. But I think if that, depending on how this works out, that's likely to be the case. Now, the reason for that, I think, is because there's already been a regime change in Iran, effectively, with the assassination, which I believe it was, of President Raisi. I mean, when we saw the pager attack in Lebanon, and then we saw and thought back to what happened to Raisi, whose grave I actually visited in Mashhad earlier last year, they replaced him with a popular vote where Pezeshkian wins the vote, and him and his advisor Zarif are reformists, yes, but I would say they're counter-revolutionaries. And I think that the problem is the balance of forces inside Iran is problematic because of that. So there are these reformists who are effectively counter-revolutionaries, and then you've got Khamenei, and you've got the IRGC and the Quds Force, who are kind of the custodians of the revolution. And there is a fight internally. I mean, there's already been sort of stories about various reformists, including Rouhani, being under house arrest, and Pezeshkian allowing some of the terrorist forces sent by the Mossad to be released from prison. And so there's a sort of dispute inside the Islamic Republic. And I think that is what is more likely to lead to a deal with the Americans. And that, and then the question is what the Zionists will do. Now, to be fair to Joti's argument, I mean, if the Zionists attack, then Iran will defend itself, and they have the capacity to defend themselves. I mean, I don't know if you saw the opinion poll which came out earlier today, which showed that a big majority, over 70% of the Iranian public, believes that they shouldn't negotiate on missiles. And a big majority believes that they can withstand an attack by the US. But it was revealed there was an interesting gender split, that women were much more likely to believe that they could withstand US imperialism than were men. So I'm just thinking, if the people in the CIA are thinking about how to play this, they should start a new campaign called Men Life Freedom. It might work better than Women Life Freedom one.
I actually think they pissed off the women by pretending to be on their side. It's very patronizing, isn't it? I think that. And of course, just following on from what David was saying about the gender split there, it's very interesting. Whenever you go to any revolutionary country that has, a revolution is something that involves the mass of the population to make it and to keep it in place. And every revolutionary country I've ever been to, at the grassroots, the revolution is held together by grannies, right? It's women who hold communities together. And if you make a revolution, it's based in community. And that means you've got the mass participation of working class women. And the strongest of them, I have to say this because I'm getting there myself, the strongest of them are women of a certain age, got a certain level of life experience. They've brought up their kids, they bring out their grandkids, they're holding every kind of shit together. They're the people who hold communities together, and they're the people who hold revolutions together. You go all the way back to the Russian Revolution, you see the same thing. You go to Venezuela, you see it. You go to Cuba, you see it. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, no matter, despite all the propaganda we get about what a terrible time the women of Iran are having, if that's not also the case in Iran. We do, of course, know that I think something like 60% of Iranian graduates today are women. So that statistic all by itself tells you something, doesn't it? That you're not quite getting the right picture from the propaganda tropes. I don't have a crystal ball for whether or not there's going to be an attack this week or next week. What's clear to me is the imperialists in general are in a hole and they can't stop digging. They need war to rebalance their system. If it doesn't happen today with Iran, it happened tomorrow. They tried to provoke war with the DPRK back Now I'm losing track of time. Was it December just gone? Or the December before? Anyway, it was definitely in December. And if I've missed a year, sorry. I think it was last year. I think it was October through December. There were several attempts to start to kick off false flags that would provoke, or to make provocations that would, that either, so a false flag that they could say the DPRK attacked us, even though it wasn't, it was a false flag, or a provocation that would provoke the DPRK to think something was happening and start an attack. So they tried to reignite the war front in Korea. They failed at that point. And then the regime, the really fascistic regime they had in place, got basically ousted by popular demand, and that's gone on the back burner. But does that mean they're not going to try again? No, it doesn't. You know, can imperialism survive its own crisis without driving to war with Russia, Iran, DPRK, China, Cuba, Venezuela? It can't. It can't. It's imperative. So whether or not it happens this week, whether or not that particular war front goes quiet again for a while, that depends on the particular balance of forces right at this moment, and a whole complex calculus that I'm not involved in. But we can see from everything that's happening in the world, the imperialists are going to keep coming around. And it's also clear that part of their strategy is, and I have to say, I think they're failing in their strategy. Just to explain, everything that happens is not everything the imperialists plan to happen. I think it's really important to understand that. We tend to look at things and then we work backwards and say, oh, they wanted to do that all along. And, well, yeah, they did. But that doesn't mean that everything you see is exactly how they wanted it to be. In 2022, when they launched a special military operation, they had convinced themselves that the Russian economy was the size of Texas or Wales or some shit, that it was an oil well with a flag, that the people hated the government, that it just needed a little push, a little bit of economic pressure, and the whole thing was going to fall down, right? And the sanctions regime that was implemented and that the Europeans knew would hurt them. They knew when they implemented the sanctions against Russia that was going to hurt them. But their assumption was short term. We'll take a bit of pain for 6 weeks or so, then the Kremlin will fall, and we'll all go marching in with Ronald McDonald and have a lovely looting time, and that little bit of pain will all be worth it. 4 years later, they're still telling themselves those stories. They're still telling themselves, writing every day in the British newspapers, how Russia can't take its casualties. They're trying to tell themselves that it's about to go right for them because they can't face the thought of what a monumental catastrophe they've actually made. They need that war to come out in their favor. So they won't even admit to themselves that it's not coming out in their favor. They're just like, well, just find a way to keep it going. And if we just keep it going for long enough, that will erode, erode the ability of the Russians to resist. That will erode their economy. It will erode their social cohesion. We'll somehow bring them down. And that is, so their thinking is that we can just keep chipping away at every member of the axis of resistance, and eventually, they'll start to fall. And if you see what all of the bravado and the shouting and everything, underneath it all is a kind of desire to find a way to bring that. They've got these kind of domino theories, don't they? They thought Syria was the stepping stone to Iraq. Iraq is a stepping stone to Russia and China. Russia was supposed to be a stepping stone to China. It's all, they have this big chessboard strategy that they think they're following. They have a lot of plans, a lot of hopes, but fundamentally they need war. They need war as a way actually to revitalize the economy, some productive activity and some area of the economy that's actually functioning. There's someone can make some money out of that. They need war for all the reconstruction contracts afterwards when you've destroyed a whole load of stuff. But fundamentally, they need a big looting bonanza. And that is why Russia and China are the big targets, because they are huge areas with huge natural resources that really could allow a restabilization, temporary, of the imperialist economy for a decade or two before we're back where we are again. Right? That's their brilliant plan. Our job is to make sure they don't get to fulfill it.